Sonja, how are sharks doing?
Sharks are mostly in trouble, and some species are in really big trouble. And this comes from a variety of reasons. Sharks in general, they tend to grow very slowly and mature late and have a small number of young. So their populations can be easily overfished. And once they are, it can take a long time for shark populations to come back to healthy levels. And the other part of it is that sharks are generally not highly regarded. So fishermen might find them to be pests. At the same time, other fishermen might want to keep them if they catch them. There are growing demand for not just the shark fins, but the shark parts. And then a lot of people, the general public, a lot of them are kind of afraid of sharks. So they don't get the respect that they deserve, and there's not, it's growing, but there's not sufficient public outcry for more shark conservation measures and protections for sharks because too many people have a misperception of what sharks are.
All right. You mentioned the precautionary approach to management in your presentation. What is that?
The precautionary approach generally means that when we're faced with uncertainty, which is often the case with sharks because of their low priority, means that we don't have all the information that we need to conserve them properly. So it can be that we don't know how far they're swimming, what their migrations are, or how many babies they have, or how old they are when they start to reproduce. It can also mean that we don't know very often who's fishing what sharks where, how many sharks are being taken from the ocean. So when we're faced with this uncertainty, the precautionary approach says that we'll err on the side of caution. So meaning, for example, instead of starting a shark fishery on a species and developing a new market for a shark product, you would put in maybe a precautionary limit, try to limit the fishery, get a handle on the biology and the status of the population and how much fishing it can support before you let the fishery take off. And it can often get too late to conserve them because, again, they're so slow growing.
All right. You mentioned in your presentation some of the somewhat limited successes globally there have been in shark conservation. Yeah. Can you touch on some of those?
Sure. My presentation, we looked at the last 20 years, and on one side there have been significant advances for shark conservation. There were 20 years ago there were essentially no limits on shark fishing. Now we have an international plan of action that's devoted to shark conservation. We have sharks being listed under wildlife treaties where they're getting special protection and being treated more like wildlife than like commodities. We have a number of countries banning shark fishing altogether because they're usually more interested in having sharks alive to support ecotourism, or they've seen that they don't make good targets for sustainable fisheries. We have a lot more bans on the practice of shark finning, which is cutting off a shark's fin, tossing the body at sea. We're having international bans on that, and many countries banning that practice, and a few countries actually limiting the amount of sharks that can be taken in fisheries and having recovery plans for overfished species. So the tremendous progress, much more awareness in the last couple decades, and I don't think that the public or fishery managers or wildlife conservationists have ever been more ready to conserve sharks. But at the same time, we have so much work to do. We have a great number of threatened shark species. We still have sharks ranking below species like tuna and cod in terms of fishery priorities. We still don't have enough information, not enough money going to research, not enough enforcement of the rules we have, and not enough collection of the shark catches that are going on. So we basically need to build on the momentum and pick up the pace if we're going to, in some case, have sustainable shark fisheries in some cases, or recover depleted shark populations, but also in some cases to really save some species from extinction. We really need to pick up the pace.
Conservation-minded citizens around the world held their breaths at the last CITES meeting when 8 species of sharks were proposed for conservation status, and 7 of those failed entirely, and 1 initially succeeded but later failed. Were you there?
I was there on the IUCN delegation.
And
so Appendix 2 would have not banned the trade in those species, but it would have set limits on the exports, put an onus on countries to demonstrate that their shark trade wasn't posing a detriment to the wild populations of sharks. So very well supported, good arguments in the proposals. The proposals were supported by IUCN, but also the CITES Secretariat, Traffic, the experts that CITES parties really should look to. But we had a number of factors at this meeting that led to the defeat of these proposals. It was very disheartening for a lot of shark conservationists, but still a step forward. It was the first time for a number of these species, for the hammerheads, the oceanic whitetip, this was the first time they were proposed. All of the other sharks that have been listed on CITES have taken 2 tries. They've all failed once. We have whale sharks, white sharks, basking sharks, and all the sawfish listed under CITES, but those all had to be proposed twice. The species that made it through the committee was the poor-beagle shark. This is a relative of the white shark. A very valuable species for its meat as well as its fins, seriously depleted in the North Atlantic and traded internationally with a very solid proposal. A lot of countries that, the good news was that a lot of countries that were vocal opponents to the poor beagle listing at the last CITES meeting in 2007 really changed their tune. We had Canada and New Zealand in particular, who were adamantly opposed to this proposal last time, had changed their minds and spoke on the floor in support of this. We had the Food and Agricultural Organization of the United Nations sort of give it a thumbs up, and we had a lot of momentum. So it passed the committee. Unfortunately, there's a possibility for countries to revisit proposals that have been endorsed in committee towards the end of the meeting in the last plenary session. A lot of factors go into, there's a lot of lobbying going on. Generally, the opposition for poor beagle did come from the Asian countries this time. There's a lot of pressure. Also, it's a 2-week-long meeting, so a lot of people just simply leave before everything's final. And now we've just learned that there was a problem. It seems that there was a problem with the voting machine, and that Germany, which was the country that was the champion for this, the proponent of this poor beagle proposal, their vote was not recorded. And the vote to reopen and change the decision on poor beagle passed by 1 vote. So essentially, poor beagle should have been listed, and it just wasn't because of some sort of voting error. So it was even more heartbreaking after the fact. But there is hope for next time. The recognition that CITES is an appropriate tool for sharks, to be treating them also as wildlife. This is a really growing recognition. Many more species of sharks are being proposed, so we're hopeful for the next CITES meeting in 2 or 3 years that we'll have a much more successful meeting.
All right. What can a regular person who's not a scientist or a politician or anything like that, what can a regular person do to help save sharks?
Well, regular people can do a lot, and I would actually argue that they're the best hope for better shark conservation. And that's because in the end, although we have a lot of tools on paper, we have a lot of agreements, it's the political will that's still lacking. Now, that political will, it's difficult, but that sentiment is changing. We're seeing much more support for shark conservation from the general public, much more awareness. And the gap remains between people, the public now being informed and often very concerned about sharks, but not knowing how or where to express it so it matters. So this is something Shark Advocates International is really focused on, channeling that public concern into real action that will protect and conserve sharks. So for example, we hope to keep the public informed of key decision dates, but in general, for people that are concerned about sharks, you don't need to be an expert. Scientists have a different perspective, lawyers have a different perspective, but everybody has their reason for caring about sharks. And too often, the people that are making the decision only hear from the fishermen and the people that are most interested in fishing those sharks tomorrow or on an immediate basis. So the public can really help by contacting their politicians in the U.S. It could be as simple as writing to your congressman. You can also write to the Secretary of Commerce, who is the ultimate authority for shark and other fisheries management in the U.S. Your letter will be trickled down to the appropriate person depending on what species or what issue you're talking about. But we do need more people to to contact these decision makers, and again, all you really need is your concern. Explain your perspective. These people, in the end, work for you. If you live on the coast, you have a state person that's working for you on fisheries. They often don't hear from the general public about shark conservation. When they have, we've seen them really change course and set scientifically based limits for sharks. You have members of Congress, senators. We have now a very important bill in Congress about shark finning. We need people to voice their support, particularly to their senators, to support that Shark Conservation Act and get that passed. It would really strengthen the shark finning regulations. So I really do think it not only can help, but it's the best hope for sharks in terms of getting the decision makers to act on the sharks' behalf and stop taking such a short-term economic perspective.
All right. Tell me a little bit about Shark Advocates International.
Shark Advocates International is a new nonprofit organization dedicated to sharks. We've just started it in May of 2010, and we will be focusing on a variety of projects around the world, but it's all based on setting limits for sharks, shark fishing and trade that are based either on science or the precautionary approach or a combination. But we're really focused on the actual limits that will conserve sharks, and we have a number of particular projects that we're looking to get into. I serve on some advisory committees for coastal sharks in the U.S. Atlantic, many of which have been quite overfished. The spiny dogfish, a small shark that was severely depleted off New England, is now coming close to being towards rebuilt or recovery. We want to make sure that we don't blow that opportunity. We want to make sure that the science-based limits stay in place. We have also in the U.S. South Atlantic sawfish listed under the Endangered Species Act, the only marine fish so far to be listed of U.S. waters to be listed under the ESA, and we have a recovery plan that spans, unfortunately, 100 years. But we want to keep sawfish, we want to implement that plan, keep them safe from fisheries bycatch, unintentional take, and fisheries like shrimp trawls and so forth in the South Atlantic. Make sure that we don't lose sawfish. And we're also trying to get some proactive management for new species of sharks and rays that haven't been subject to fisheries before, but markets might be changing and fisheries might be taking off with no limits. So the example of that is the cow-nosed ray, which is another often demonized species of the mid-Atlantic region. And we've seen a lot of effort putting into marketing them to local restaurants, but also markets as far as Korea. And we're not against the fishery, but we want to have some limits put in and get an assessment to see what the population can handle. Because again, it's like a shark, very slow growing, one baby a year, can't sustain an intense, unregulated fishery for very long. So it's kind of running the gamut in terms of trying to save some species from extinction and trying to learn lessons from the past and limit shark fisheries before it's too late. And then in the middle, recovering what we have overfished.
All right. Is there anything else you'd like to say about sharks or shark conservation? Are you optimistic for the future?
I have to be optimistic. I mean, sometimes it's hard to be optimistic, but I do think that the momentum is really building, that we have more tools for conservation than we ever have. We have more recognition that sharks are vulnerable and sharks are in trouble than we ever had, and we have more attention and more awareness from our policymakers. So we just need to close a couple gaps and keep moving forward, but again, at a bit of a quicker pace, so that we can recover the sharks that have been overfished and save some species from extinction and prevent overfishing of others.